They were told they were unfit for combat. They were told they lacked the intelligence to handle modern machinery and the courage to face the German Wehrmacht. The United States Army categorized them as unskilled labor, a polite term for men they intended to use only for digging ditches and loading crates. Yet, in the summer of 1944, the fate of the entire free world rested in their calloused hands. When General Patton's tanks ran dry and the liberation of Europe ground to a terrifying halt, these men, the segregated, disrespected, and underestimated black soldiers of the Quartermaster Corps, stepped into the breach. They boarded thousands of trucks, armed with nothing but carbines and caffeine, and embarked on a suicide run that would become legend. They drove bombs on wheels through flaming villages and frozen forests. They fought off Nazi ambushes and American racism in the same breath. They saved the world in 1944, only to return home to a country that refused to serve them a cup of coffee in 1945. This is the untold, adrenaline-fueled, and heartbreaking story of the Red Ball Express, the lifeline of liberty that history tried to erase. They said that wars are won by generals with maps and soldiers with rifles. They said that victory belongs to the man who can shoot the straightest and the tank that can hit the hardest. General George S. Patton, the most feared commander in the Allied forces, famously bragged that his tanks could eat anything but sand. He believed that sheer aggression and firepower were the keys to crushing the Third Reich. But in the scorching August of 1944, the greatest war machine the world had ever seen did something that terrified the Allied command more than any German counterattack could. It stopped. It didn't stop because of enemy fire. It didn't stop because of cowardice. It stopped because of physics. The massive, steel-clad beast that was the Third Army, racing across France to liberate Europe, had run out of its lifeblood. It had run out of gas. Imagine the scene. Thousands of Sherman tanks, arguably the most important weapons of the war, sitting silent in the French countryside, their engines cold, their tracks still. The crews sitting on the turrets, looking east toward Germany, unable to move a single inch. It was a logistical heart attack, and it was happening at the worst possible moment. The Germans were on the run, retreating in chaos. If the Allies could keep pushing, the war could be over by Christmas. But if they stopped, if they gave the Nazis time to regroup, to dig in, to rearm, the war could drag on for years, costing millions more lives. The silence of those tanks was the sound of impending disaster. And the solution to this disaster did not come from the high command in Washington. It didn't come from a new secret weapon developed in a laboratory. It came from the men that the United States Army had consistently marginalized, disrespected, and relegated to the shadows. It came from the men who were told they weren't smart enough for combat, who were told they lacked the discipline for the front lines. It came from the segregated trucking units, 75% of whom were African American soldiers. These men were about to undertake one of the most dangerous, exhausting, and critical missions of World War II. They were about to turn a desperate, improvised plan into a legend. They were about to board thousands of Deuce and a half trucks, loaded with tons of high-explosive ammunition and volatile gasoline, and drive into the mouth of hell without stopping. This is not a story about shooting. It is a story about driving. But make no mistake, this was combat. The road was their battlefield, the steering wheel was their weapon, and speed was their only defense. This is the story of the Red Ball Express. But before we jump into the cab of that truck and tear down the roads of France, I want to ask you something. The Red Ball Express covered a network of roads that stretched nearly 400 miles one way, a loop of asphalt and mud that connected the beaches of Normandy to the front lines of freedom. These men drove across a continent to deliver hope. I want to know where you are joining this convoy from. Whether you're in Detroit, Lagos, London, or a small town in the middle of nowhere, drop your city in the comments below. Let's see how far this story can travel today. Let's map out our own global convoy in honor of the men who kept the world moving. To understand why the Red Ball Express was necessary, you have to understand the sheer scale of the problem. When the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, they destroyed the French rail system to prevent the Germans from bringing in reinforcements. It was a brilliant tactical move, but it had a devastating side effect. Once the Allies broke out of the beachhead and started moving inland, they had no railroads to supply their own troops. The port of Cherbourg, the only deep-water port capable of handling the massive amount of supplies needed, was captured. But the Germans had wrecked it so thoroughly it was useless for months. So, all the supplies, the food, the bullets, the medicine, and most importantly, the millions of gallons of gasoline were still sitting on the beaches of Normandy. Meanwhile, the armies were moving away from the beaches at breakneck speed. Patton's Third Army was consuming 350,000 gallons of gasoline every single day. As they raced toward Paris and the German border, the supply lines stretched until they snapped. By late August, the front line was over 300 miles away from the supplies. The umbilical cord of the army was cut. Panic set in at the Supreme Headquarters. General Eisenhower and his staff knew that a stalled army was a sitting duck. They needed a miracle. They needed a way to move thousands of tons of material across a country with shattered bridges, mined roads, and pockets of resistance, and they needed to do it yesterday. In a marathon meeting that lasted 36 hours, the Army Transportation Corps devised a plan that sounded like madness. They would commandeer 2 parallel highways running from Saint-Lô to Chartres, and eventually to the outskirts of Paris. One road would be exclusively for traffic moving toward the front. The other road would be exclusively for traffic returning to the rear. It would be a giant one-way loop, a conveyor belt of steel and rubber. They called it the Red Ball Route, a term borrowed from railroad slang where a red ball signal meant priority express, clear the track. But having a route was useless without the vehicles and the men to drive them. The Army raided every unit in the European theater. They took trucks from artillery units, from anti-aircraft divisions, from infantry reserves. They scraped together nearly 6,000 trucks, mostly the workhorse GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, known affectionately as the Jimmy or the Deuce and a half. Then they needed drivers. And this is where the ugly reality of 1944 America collided with the desperate necessity of war. The Army was segregated. Black soldiers were overwhelmingly assigned to service of supply units because the racist logic of the time dictated that they were unfit for the intellectual rigors of combat or leadership. They were the stevedores, the cooks, the gravediggers, and the truck drivers. Suddenly, these men, who had been treated as second-class citizens, who were forced to sleep in separate barracks and eat in separate mess halls, became the most important soldiers in the European theater of operations. The generals realized with a cold sweat that if the black drivers didn't drive, the white soldiers didn't eat. If the black drivers didn't drive, the tanks didn't move. If the black drivers didn't drive, the war was lost. The order went out. Keep the supplies moving at all costs. It sounded simple. It was anything but. The mission wasn't just to drive. It was to drive under conditions that would break an ordinary human being. The rules were strict. Convoys were to stay in formation, maintain a speed of 25 miles per hour, and keep a distance of 60 yards between trucks. But as soon as the rubber hit the road on August 25th, 1944, the rulebook was thrown out the window. The demand for gas was too high. The urgency was too great. The drivers of the Red Ball Express found themselves in a race against time, sleep, and sanity. They weren't driving 25 miles per hour. They were tearing down narrow French country roads at 40, 50, sometimes 60 miles per hour, often with the governors, the mechanical devices that limited speed, removed by mechanics who knew that speed was life. And they weren't just driving during the day. They drove at night. And because the Luftwaffe still prowled the skies, looking for the telltale glow of headlights to strafe the columns, they had to drive in total darkness. Imagine sitting in a cab of a truck loaded with 5,000 pounds of high-explosive artillery shells. It is 3 a.m. It is pitch black. You have been awake for 24 hours. You are driving down a road you have never seen, filled with bomb craters, on the wrong side of the world. You cannot turn on your headlights. All you have to guide you are cat eyes, tiny slits of light on the truck in front of you. If you lose sight of them, you are lost in enemy territory. If you get too close and hit them, you explode. This was the life of the Red Ball drivers. They were the lifeline of democracy, racing through the dark, fueled by coffee, cigarettes, and a determination to prove that they were the best damn soldiers the Army had. They were about to embark on a logistical feat that has no parallel in the history of warfare. They were about to move the world. But as they revved their engines and rolled out of the staging areas, they knew that the road ahead was not just paved with good intentions. It was paved with danger, exhaustion, and the constant grinding friction of serving a country that didn't love them back. The convoy is moving out. The Red Ball is rolling, and nothing, not the Germans, not the exhaustion, not the Jim Crow laws, is going to stop it. To understand the Red Ball Express, you have to understand the machine that powered it. The GMC CCK debut, Deuce and a half, was a beast of a truck. It was built to haul 2.5 tons of cargo, but in the desperation of the Red Ball, the loaders didn't care about specs. They piled them high with 5, 6, sometimes 7 tons of ammunition and jerry cans. The suspension groaned under the weight. The tires bulged. And when the driver turned the key and the 6-cylinder engine roared to life, the entire frame vibrated with a violence that rattled the teeth in your skull. Now imagine doing that for 36 hours straight. The route was not the smooth paved interstate system of modern America. It was a nightmare landscape of war-torn France. The roads were narrow, winding country lanes designed for horse-drawn carts, not endless columns of heavy military transport. They were paved with cobblestones that had been pulverized by tank tracks, or they were simply dirt tracks turned into rivers of mud by the relentless European rain. In the summer heat, the dust was so thick it coated the driver's lungs like cement. In the rain, the trucks would slide and drift, threatening to tip their explosive cargo into the ditches at every turn. The Army engineers did their best. They nailed up the iconic signs, a simple red ball on a white background, at every intersection. They declared the route a one-way street. If you weren't a Red Ball truck, you got off the road. It didn't matter if you were a general in a jeep or a tank commander. When the Red Ball was rolling, it had the right of way. It was the artery of the war, and you do not block an artery. But signs and rules couldn't smooth out the craters left by German bombs. They couldn't widen the bridges that had been hastily repaired by engineers. Driving the Red Ball was a physical act of wrestling. The trucks didn't have power steering. Taking a heavy curve required the driver to stand on the brakes and wrench the wheel with every ounce of strength in his upper body. It was like fighting a bear, mile after agonizing mile. And then the sun went down. This is where the mission crossed the line, from difficult to suicidal. The Allied air superiority was strong, but it wasn't absolute. The Luftwaffe still had teeth. At night, lone German marauders, planes the GIs called bed-check Charlies, would prowl the skies, looking for a light, a spark, anything that would betray the location of a convoy. If they saw a headlight, they would strafe the column. A single 20mm cannon shell hitting a truck loaded with high-octane gasoline didn't just destroy that truck. It could trigger a chain reaction that would incinerate a quarter mile of the convoy. So, the order was absolute. Blackout conditions. No headlights, no dashboard lights, no lighters, no cigarettes. A lit cigarette tip could be seen from thousands of feet in the air. Smoking in the cab wasn't just a vice, it was an act of treason. To navigate the pitch-black French countryside, the trucks were equipped with cat eyes. These were narrow, horizontal slits on the headlights that emitted a faint, ghostly sliver of light. They didn't illuminate the road. They didn't show you the trees, or the ditches, or the cliffs. They were barely strong enough to reflect off the cat eye markers on the tailgate of the truck in front of you. Imagine the psychological terror of that. You are driving a bomb on wheels. You are moving at 40 miles per hour. You cannot see the road. You cannot see your own hands on the steering wheel. All you can see are two tiny red slits floating in the void ahead of you. If those slits get bigger, you are too close and about to crash. If they get smaller, you are falling behind and breaking the convoy. If they disappear, you are alone in the dark in a country where enemy soldiers are still hiding in the woods. The strain on the eyes was excruciating. Drivers would stare into the blackness until their vision blurred and their minds began to play tricks on them. The highway hypnosis was lethal. Men reported seeing phantom bridges that weren't there. They saw German tanks in the shadows of trees. They saw their mothers standing by the side of the road. Hallucinations were common, a symptom of brains pushed past the breaking point by adrenaline and exhaustion. Because the most dangerous enemy wasn't the Germans. It wasn't the mines. It was sleep. The Army's regulations stated that drivers were supposed to switch off, resting while the assistant driver took the wheel. But the manpower shortage was so acute, and the demand for supplies so voracious that these rules were often ignored. Drivers would push for 24, 36, sometimes 48 hours without real sleep. They subsisted on cold K rations eaten with one hand while steering with the other. They drank gallons of bitter, mud-thick coffee. They slapped their own faces to stay awake. When a truck broke down, and they broke down constantly under the strain, the driver couldn't just pull over and wait for a tow. The convoy couldn't stop. A stopped convoy was a dead convoy. If a truck died, the driver had to push it off the road, into a ditch, and abandon it to be picked up by the roving repair crews later. He would jump onto the running board of the next truck, hanging on for dear life as the express kept rolling. The pressure from the top was crushing. General Patton was famous for his aggression, but his aggression was fueled by gasoline. He sent messages back to the supply depots that were essentially threats. "Give me gas, or I will stop fighting." The commanders of the Red Ball Express passed that pressure down to the officers, who passed it down to the sergeants, who screamed it into the faces of the black drivers. Don't stop. Don't slow down. Get it there. This created a culture of reckless speed. The official speed limit was 25 km/h. In reality, trucks were tearing through French villages at 60 mph. The governors on the carburetors, designed to limit the speed to protect the engines, were the first things to go. Mechanics would disable them, often with the tacit approval of officers who looked the other way. The Red Ball became a drag race, with the fate of the free world as the prize. But speed kills. The roads of the Red Ball route were littered with the carcasses of trucks that had missed a turn in the dark. Accidents were frequent and horrific. A truck loaded with artillery shells hitting a stone wall at 50 mph didn't leave survivors. It left a crater. The drivers would pass the burning wrecks of their comrades, unable to stop, the orange glow of the fire illuminating the sweat on their faces for a fleeting second before they plunged back into the dark. There was a grim fatalism that took hold of the men. They knew they were expendable. They knew that to the high command, the cargo was more valuable than the driver. If a truck made it to the front, and the driver died delivering it. The mission was considered a success. Yet, despite the horror, there was a rhythm to it. A mechanical ballet of logistics. At its peak, the Red Ball Express had nearly 6,000 trucks on the road at any given time. A truck passed a checkpoint every few seconds, day and night, for 3 months. It was a river of steel that never ran dry. The sheer volume of material moved is staggering. Over 400,000 tons of supplies delivered in 81 days. But statistics are cold. They don't capture the feeling of the mud caking on your boots. They don't capture the smell of unwashed bodies and diesel fumes. They don't capture the feeling of isolation. Because these men weren't just battling the road. They were battling a feeling of profound loneliness. They were driving through liberated France, yes, but they were often driving through a void. They were separated from their units, separated from the white combat troops they supported, and separated from the gratitude of the nation they served. They were the invisible men driving the most visible trucks in the war. As the convoy rumbled through the medieval villages of France, the stone walls echoing with the roar of engines, the French civilians would peek out from their shutters. They saw a relentless force of nature. But if they looked closely, in the brief flash of a lighter or the glow of dawn, they saw the faces behind the windshields. They saw black faces. Faces etched with exhaustion. Faces tight with concentration. These were not the faces of the unskilled laborers the army pamphlets described. These were the faces of experts. Men who could feel the slide of a truck on mud before it happened. Men who could judge the distance to a bumper in pitch blackness by instinct alone. Men who had mastered the art of endurance in a way that their white counterparts in the rear echelon could not imagine. They were the kings of the road, but they were driving in a kingdom that didn't want them. And as we prepare to look closer at who these men actually were, the teachers, the farmers, the jazz musicians who found themselves behind the wheel of a Deuce and a half, we have to remember that every mile they drove was a mile driven in defiance. They were defying the Germans. They were defying the limits of the human body. And most importantly, they were defying the lie that they were not soldiers. The road ahead is long, the gas tank is full, and the Red Ball Express is just getting up to speed. Who were they? If you looked at the official Army roster, they were listed as personnel of the Motor Transport Service. If you looked at the table of organization, they were Service of Supply Troops. If you listened to the generals in Washington, they were laborers, men suited only for the heavy lifting, the digging, and the hauling. But if you looked through the windshield of a Deuce and a half tearing through a French village at 3 a.m., you saw the truth. You saw a black man. 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers were African American. This statistic was not an accident of random assignment. It was the product of a systemic, calculated policy of segregation. The United States Army in 1944 was a mirror of the United States itself. Deeply divided, institutionally racist, and obsessed with the color line. The prevailing wisdom among the military brass, men who had grown up in a segregated society and attended segregated academies, was that African Americans lacked the combat temperament. They cited pseudoscience and biased World War I reports to claim that black soldiers would panic under fire, that they lacked the killer instinct, and that they did not possess the technical intelligence to operate tanks or aircraft. So, when the draft notices went out and hundreds of thousands of black men answered the call, the Army faced a dilemma. They had the manpower, but they refused to use it in the infantry. The solution was the service of supply. The Army decided that if they couldn't trust black men to shoot the guns, they would use them to carry the bullets. They funneled the vast majority of black draftees into quartermaster units, engineering corps, and transportation battalions. It was intended as a slight. It was intended to keep them in the background, away from the glory, away from the medals, and away from the officers' mess. But in the chaotic, fluid reality of World War II, the Army's racism backfired in the most spectacular way possible. By concentrating black troops in transportation, the Army inadvertently placed the fate of the entire war into their hands. They created a situation where the most critical mission in the European theater, the Red Ball Express, could only be accomplished by the very men they had marginalized. But these men were not the uneducated monolith the Army imagined. Behind the wheel of those trucks sat a cross-section of Black America. There were sharecroppers from Mississippi who had never driven a vehicle before joining the Army. Men who had to be taught how to double-clutch a transmission in a muddy field in Georgia. But sitting right next to them were college graduates from Howard University. There were jazz musicians from Harlem. There were lawyers from Chicago. There were school teachers from Detroit. The draft didn't care about your degree if you were black. A PhD and a field hand were both likely to end up in the same truck, wearing the same grease-stained fatigues, bound together by the same mission and the same prejudice. This created a unique culture within the Red Ball Express. It was a brotherhood forged in irony. They called themselves the Red Ballers. They developed their own slang, their own style. They modified their uniforms, tilting their caps, wearing scarves with a dash of flair that infuriated the buttoned-up white MPs. They personalized their trucks, painting names on the bumpers like Sweet Georgia Brown or Harlem Hellfighter. But beneath the swagger was a simmering rage and a complex motivation. Why drive? Why risk your life delivering gas to a tank commanded by a white officer who wouldn't let you sit at his table? Why push yourself to the brink of insanity for a country where you couldn't vote? For many, the answer lay in the Double V campaign. Victory abroad against fascism, and victory at home against racism. They understood the stakes better than anyone. They knew that if they failed, the racists back home would say, "See, we told you they couldn't do it." Failure was not an option because their performance was the argument for their citizenship. Every ton of supplies delivered was a down payment on their civil rights. They were driving to prove a point. And then there was the experience of France itself. For a black soldier from Alabama or Texas, landing in France was like stepping onto another planet. It wasn't just the architecture or the language, it was the eyes of the people. When the Red Ball trucks rolled into a liberated town, the French didn't recoil. They cheered. They threw flowers. French women, white women, would climb onto the running boards to kiss the drivers. French families would invite them into their homes for dinner. For the first time in their lives, many of these men felt the crushing weight of racism lift off their shoulders. They breathed free air. They realized that the way they were treated in America was not a law of nature. It was a choice made by their countrymen. This taste of dignity was intoxicating. It was also dangerous. A man who has tasted respect is a man who will not easily go back to submission. But this newfound freedom in France stood in stark, violent contrast to the behavior of the American military police. The MPs were the enforcers of American racism abroad. They patrolled the Red Ball route, not just to keep traffic moving, but to keep the black drivers in check. They set up checkpoints that felt more like border crossings. They harassed drivers for minor uniform infractions. They enforced off-limits zones in French towns, effectively segregating the liberators from the liberated. There were ugly incidents, shootings, brawls in bars where white soldiers tried to throw black soldiers out, only to find that the truck drivers fought back with the ferocity of combat veterans. The Red Ballers were armed. They carried carbines in their cabs, and they had a code. They wouldn't start a fight, but they sure as hell would finish it. They weren't going to take orders from a Jim Crow sheriff in the middle of a war zone. Yet, despite this friction, there was a strange, transactional respect that developed on the road. The white combat troops at the front, the guys in the foxholes, The tank crews running on fumes didn't care about the color of the driver. They cared about the cargo. When a red ball truck pulled up to a stalled armored column, the black driver was the most popular man in the world. General Patton himself, a man known for his erratic views on race, understood this dynamic. He famously said, "I don't give a damn what color you are, so long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." It wasn't an enlightened view, but it was a pragmatic one. He ordered his commanders to ignore the segregation rules if it meant moving faster. He shook hands with red ball drivers. He pinned medals on them. He knew that without them, he was just a man with a lot of stationary metal. One of the most poignant dynamics was the interaction between the black drivers and the German prisoners of war they often passed or transported. The Germans, fed on Nazi propaganda, expected to see the master race leading the American army. Instead, they saw an army powered by the very people Hitler had deemed Untermensch, subhuman. They saw black men commanding massive machines, organizing complex logistics, and looking down at the defeated supermen from the high cab of a GMC truck. The red ball drivers reveled in this. It was a cosmic joke at Hitler's expense. Every mile they drove a stake through the heart of Nazi ideology. But we must not romanticize their suffering. The emotional toll of fighting for a country that despised you was heavy. Letters home were filled with guarded optimism, but also deep pain. They wrote about the mud and the rain, but between the lines, they wrote about the sting of being called a slur by a fellow American soldier. They wrote about the fear that when the war ended, the gratitude would evaporate. They were right to be worried. But in the autumn of 1944, there was no time for existential dread. There was only the road. The red ballers had become a tribe of nomads. They lived in their trucks. They slept in the cargo beds on top of ammunition crates. They cooked their rations on the hot manifolds of their engines. They became experts in the geography of a foreign land, navigating by church steeples and the stars. They were the unsung elite. The Army had the Rangers, the Airborne, the Marines. But the Quartermaster Corps had the red ballers. They didn't have a cool patch or a special beret. They had bloodshot eyes and grease under their fingernails. They had the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much road and not enough sleep. They were the heartbeat of the invasion. And as the weeks dragged on and the trucks began to fall apart under the strain, it was the ingenuity of these men, the unskilled laborers, that would keep the heart beating. Because when you drive a truck 24 hours a day for months, things break. And when things broke in the middle of nowhere, with no spare parts and no mechanics, the red ball drivers had to perform miracles of engineering on the side of the road. They were about to show the Army that they weren't just drivers. They were MacGyvers of the motorway. They were about to turn the Red Ball Express into a feat of mechanical wizardry that would leave the official Army engineers scratching their heads. The road is getting rougher. The tires are wearing thin. And the enemy is getting closer. But the red ballers are just shifting into a higher gear because they know that the only way out is through, and they aren't stopping for anyone. War is a hungry beast. It eats men, it eats ammunition, and it eats machines. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express was devouring trucks at a rate that terrified the logistical planners in the rear. The GMC CCKW, sturdy as it was designed for tactical support, for short hauls over rough terrain, followed by periods of maintenance. It was not designed to be run at redline speeds, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, loaded to double its rated capacity without ever cooling down. The trucks began to die. It started with the tires. The roads of France were littered with the debris of war. Shrapnel, shell casings, sharp stones from ruined buildings, and the discarded equipment of the retreating German army. The rubber tires of the Red Ball trucks were shredded. In the summer heat, the friction of the overloaded axles caused tires to overheat and blow out with the force of a grenade. A blowout at 45 miles per hour in a top-heavy truck loaded with 105mm howitzer shells wasn't just a flat tire, it was a catastrophic event. Trucks would careen off the road, flipping into ditches, spilling their precious cargo into the mud. Then came the engines. The constant strain of hauling 6 tons up the hills of Normandy caused radiators to boil over and gaskets to blow. Pistons seized. Rods were thrown through engine blocks. Transmissions, abused by drivers desperately trying to maintain momentum, ground themselves into metal shavings. By the second week of the operation, the Red Ball route was lined with the carcasses of abandoned trucks. It looked like a mechanical graveyard. To the casual observer, it might have looked like failure, but to the men of the Red Ball, it was just another challenge to be overcome with the same defiance they used against Jim Crow. The Army had established maintenance battalions, but they were overwhelmed. They couldn't keep up with the carnage. So, the burden of keeping the fleet moving fell onto the drivers themselves and the roving bands of black mechanics who operated mobile repair shops along the route. This is where the myth of the unskilled labor was definitively shattered. The Army had assumed that black soldiers lacked the technical aptitude for complex mechanics. They were wrong. The men of the Red Ball Express turned into the greatest improvisational engineers the world had ever seen. They became the MacGyvers of the motorway. They didn't have spare parts. The supply system was so focused on getting gas to the front that it forgot to send spark plugs, fan belts, and carburetors to the rear. So, the drivers scavenged. When a truck was wrecked beyond repair, it didn't stay a wreck for long. Within minutes, a crew would descend upon it like locusts. They would strip the alternator. They would pull the fuel pump. They would unbolt the wheels. They engaged in a massive, rolling program of cannibalization. They built Frankenstein trucks, vehicles stitched together from the bones of 3 or 4 dead machines. They learned to fix things with whatever they had on hand. A leaking radiator was plugged with oatmeal or egg whites, which would cook in the heat and seal the hole. A snapped fan belt was replaced with rope, or in legendary tellings, with pantyhose acquired from a local French village. A broken fuel line was patched with tape and prayer. They welded cracked axles on the side of the road in the pouring rain, shielding the arc of the welder with tarps so the light wouldn't attract German planes. This mechanical ballet was performed under the most extreme pressure imaginable. A breakdown on the Red Ball route was a cardinal sin. If your truck died in the middle of the road, you were blocking the artery. You were stopping the blood flow to Patton's heart. The standing order was ruthless. If a truck couldn't be fixed in place immediately, it was to be pushed off the road and abandoned. The drivers hated abandoning their trucks. A driver forms a bond with his machine. It is his home, his shield, his lifeline. So they fought for them. They developed a pit crew mentality. If a tire blew, they could change the dual rear wheels of a Deuce and a half in minutes, in the dark, in the mud, while convoys roared past them inches away. And let's talk about that danger. Maintenance on the Red Ball Express was a contact sport. The road was narrow. The trucks were wide. At night, driving on cat eyes, visibility was near zero. A mechanic working on a truck on the shoulder was taking his life in his hands. Many men were crushed to death in the darkness, struck by exhausted drivers who drifted a few inches out of their lane. They died with wrenches in their hands, their blood mixing with the oil on the French pavement. Yet, the maintenance crews, almost entirely black units, like the 550th Quartermaster Battalion, worked with a pride that bordered on arrogance. They painted slogans on their wreckers. They bragged about their turnaround times. They knew that without them, the Red Ball would be a parking lot. They also revolutionized the way logistics were handled. The Army set up a system of roving patrols. Jeeps loaded with mechanics and tools would cruise the line, looking for trouble. When they found a stalled truck, they would leap into action. If the engine was blown, they wouldn't try to fix it. They would simply swap the entire engine out on the side of the road. They utilized boom trucks to lift the heavy blocks, working with a speed and precision that stunned the white officers who observed them. This ingenuity extended to the tires. With rubber in short supply, the 320th Quartermaster Battalion set up massive tire repair shops in open fields. They processed tens of thousands of tires, patching tubes, retreading casings, keeping the rubber meeting the road. They worked in assembly lines, singing spirituals and blues to keep the rhythm, turning a dirty industrial job into a symphony of efficiency. But perhaps the most impressive feat was the sheer endurance of the equipment under the hands of these men. A standard Army truck was supposed to be serviced every 1,000 miles. On the Red Ball, they were running 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 miles, without a proper service. The oil turned to sludge. The grease fittings ran dry. But the drivers developed a sixth sense for their machines. They could hear a valve tapping from 50 yards away. They could feel a wheel bearing starting to seize through the vibration of the steering wheel. They nursed these dying machines to the front lines through sheer force of will. There was a symbiotic relationship between the man and the machine. The truck was the equalizer. Inside the cab, the black driver was the master of his domain. The truck gave him power. It gave him mobility. It gave him a weapon. A 2.5-ton truck moving at 50 miles per hour is a battering ram. There are stories of Red Ball drivers who, upon encountering German roadblocks or ambushes, didn't stop and surrender. They downshifted, floored the accelerator, and smashed through, using the brute force of American steel to clear the path. The truck also became a symbol of American abundance to the starving people of Europe. As the convoys passed, the drivers would toss candy, cigarettes, and rations to the children lining the roads. For a French child, the sight of a black man leaning out of a massive truck, smiling and throwing chocolate, was a formative memory. It upended the Nazi propaganda they had lived under for 4 years. The Nazis had depicted black people as savages. The Red Ball drivers showed them kindness, power, and generosity. They were the ambassadors of American goodwill, delivering not just gasoline, but a new image of humanity. But the toll on the men was physical as well as psychological. The vibration of the trucks caused nerve damage in their hands and arms. The Red Ball rough ride caused kidney issues and chronic back pain. The diesel fumes, inhaled 24 hours a day, caused respiratory problems. And the accidents, the horrific, metal-twisting crashes, left men mangled. There were no seatbelts, no airbags. When a truck hit a tree, the steering column acted like a spear. Yet, they kept the trucks running. Why? Because they knew what was in the back. They weren't hauling rocks. They were hauling 105mm shells for the artillery that was protecting their brothers. They were hauling plasma for the medics. They were hauling the gasoline that allowed the tanks to liberate concentration camps. They understood the grim math of logistics. If the truck stops, the killing stops, but the dying continues. The mechanical miracle of the Red Ball Express is often overshadowed by the driving itself, but they are inseparable. You cannot drive a truck that doesn't run. The black soldiers of the Quartermaster Corps proved that they were not just stevedores. They were technicians. They were innovators. They were capable of sustaining a mechanized army over distances that military doctrine said were impossible. They did it with baling wire and tape. They did it with stolen parts and scavenged rubber. They did it with a genius born of necessity. In the segregated South, black people had always had to make do with less, to fix what was broken, to improvise survival. They took those survival skills, the skills forged in the crucible of Jim Crow poverty, and applied them to the liberation of Europe. They turned the GMC truck into a chariot of freedom and they kept the wheels turning when the whole world was waiting for them to fall off. As the convoy pushes deeper into France, the mechanical challenges are about to be compounded by a new threat. The closer they get to the front, the more the war pushes back. The red ball is entering the danger zone. The roads are mined. The snipers are waiting. And the rear area is about to become the front line. The mechanics wipe the grease from their hands, grab their carbines, and jump back into the cabs. The engine roars. The vibration starts again. The red ball rolls on. And the men behind the wheel are about to find out that the road to Germany is paved with more than just mud. It is paved with blood. There is a dangerous lie in the history of warfare, a line drawn on maps that separates the front line from the rear area. The front line is where the glory is, where the bullets fly and the medals are won. The rear area is supposed to be safe, a place of boring logistics and paperwork. But in the autumn of 1944, the Red Ball Express erased that line. The men driving the trucks discovered a terrifying truth. In modern mobile warfare, there is no rear. The war is everywhere. And when you are driving a rolling bomb loaded with 2,000 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, you are always on the front line. General Patton's blitzkrieg across France was brilliant, but it was messy. His tanks moved so fast that they bypassed entire German divisions. Thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers, desperate, hungry, and heavily armed, were left stranded in the forests and hedgerows along the Red Ball route. They were cut off from their command, but they still had their Mauser rifles, their MP-40 submachine guns, and their Panzerfausts. And they quickly realized that the easiest way to hurt the Americans wasn't to attack the tanks they couldn't penetrate, but to attack the soft-skinned trucks that kept the tanks moving. The roads of the Red Ball Express became a shooting gallery. Imagine the psychological state of a driver. You are alone in the cab, the engine roaring, the vibration numbing your hands. The road winds through a dense forest. It is beautiful, picturesque French countryside. But every tree line is a potential ambush. Every stone wall could hide a sniper. You know that the Germans are out there. You know they are targeting you specifically. They aim for the driver first. If they kill the driver, the truck crashes, blocking the road for hours. The crack of a rifle shot over the roar of a truck engine is a distinct, sickening sound. It is often followed by the shattering of the windshield. Drivers learn to drive with one eye on the road and one eye scanning the ditches. They kept their M1 carbines on the seat beside them, chambered and ready. They weren't just truck drivers. They were mechanized infantry who hadn't been told they were infantry. There were firefights, furious, chaotic skirmishes that broke out when a convoy was halted by a felled tree or a suspiciously placed cart. The black drivers, men the army said lacked the combat temperament, would pile out of their cabs, take cover behind their wheels, and return fire with a ferocity that stunned the German ambushers. Some trucks were equipped with ring-mounted 50 caliber machine guns on the roof of the cab. The sight of a black quartermaster soldier manning a Deuce, laying down suppressing fire while his convoy sped through a kill zone, was a reality that never made it into the newsreels. But the Germans had a weapon more terrifying than the sniper's bullet: the mine. The retreating German army had sown the roads of France with death. They used teller mines, flat, saucer-shaped anti-tank mines packed with explosives. They buried them in potholes. They hid them under loose cobblestones. They wired them to tripwires strung across the road at windshield height to decapitate drivers who had their canvas tops down. Driving the Red Ball required a hypervigilance that was exhausting. You had to read the road surface like Braille. Is that patch of dirt slightly darker than the rest? Is that pile of leaves unnatural? If you guessed wrong, you didn't just get a flat tire. The explosion would vaporize the cab. If you were hauling ammunition, your truck would become a crater, taking the truck behind you with it. The fear of mines turned the journey into a game of Russian roulette played at 40 miles per hour. Drivers would watch the tracks of the truck in front of them with obsessive intensity. If he made it, I can make it. But sometimes, the mine was set with a delay fuse designed to detonate on the 10th or 20th vehicle in the column. The randomness of the violence was psychologically shredding. You could do everything right and still die in a flash of white light. And the danger didn't stop when the sun went down. In fact, it multiplied. The Luftwaffe, though crippled, was not dead. At night, lone German planes, bed-check Charlies, would patrol the supply routes. They looked for the sparks of exhaust pipes or the glow of a cigarette. When they found a convoy, they would drop flares, turning the night into day, and then come in for a strafing run. The sound of aircraft engines at night triggered a primal panic. There was nowhere to hide. You couldn't dig a foxhole in the cab of a moving truck. You just had to grip the wheel, pray, and keep driving, hoping the tracers missed your fuel tank. But for the black drivers of the Red Ball Express, the enemy wasn't just the Germans. They faced a threat that wore the same uniform they did, a threat that spoke English, a threat that carried the authority of the United States government, the military police. The MPs assigned to patrol the Red Ball route were overwhelmingly white. And many of them viewed their job not as facilitating traffic, but as policing black men. The racial dynamics of the Jim Crow South were transplanted whole onto the roads of France. To a racist MP, a black man driving a powerful vehicle, armed with a weapon, and moving with autonomy was deeply unsettling. It disrupted the natural order. So they used their authority to reassert control. The checkpoints became flashpoints. MPs would stop convoys for minor infractions. A uniform button undone. A truck following too closely. A headlight that was slightly too bright. They would scream racial slurs at exhausted men who had been driving for 30 hours straight. They would threaten them with the stockade. They would pull their sidearms. There are documented accounts of speed traps set up by MPs, not to ensure safety, but to harass black drivers. Imagine the insanity of it. The entire Allied war effort depends on these trucks moving fast. General Patton is screaming for gas, and yet an MP is pulling over a convoy to write tickets and humiliate the drivers because he doesn't like their attitude. It was a sabotage of the war effort, driven by bigotry. The tension was palpable. The drivers, pushed to the brink by exhaustion and the stress of combat, had little patience for disrespect. They were armed, and they were angry. There were standoffs on the side of the road that teetered on the edge of mutiny. Guns were drawn. Threats were exchanged. "You need to move that Jeep, soldier, or I'm going to run right over it." The Red Ball drivers developed a code of silence and mutual protection against the MPs. They flashed their lights to warn oncoming trucks of speed traps. They traveled in packs. If an MP harassed one driver, 5 other trucks would pull over, and 5 other drivers would step out, carbines in hand, silently watching. It was a show of force, a reminder that out here, on the lonely roads of France, the power dynamic wasn't as clear-cut as it was in Alabama. This internal war, the friction between the black transporters and the white enforcers, added a layer of psychological weight to the mission that is hard to quantify. It meant that the drivers could never truly relax. They were scanning the trees for Germans and scanning the rearview mirror for Americans. They were fighting on 2 fronts, squeezed between the enemy who wanted to kill them and the countrymen who wanted to break them. Yet, amidst this hostility, the drivers found moments of profound connection with the combat troops they were supplying. When a Red Ball convoy finally reached the front lines, often driving right up to the tank loggers and artillery pits, the reception was different. The white soldiers in the foxholes, filthy and terrified, didn't care about the race of the man bringing them ammo. They cheered, they offered coffee, they treated the drivers like rock stars. In the forward areas, the segregation broke down. Under fire, nobody cares about water fountains. The drivers would help unload the shells, often under mortar bombardment, working side by side with white gunners. They would share stories. They would realize that they were all just frightened young men trying to survive. These moments of integration were fleeting, but they were real. They proved that the problem wasn't the soldiers, it was the system. But the system remained. As the Red Ball Express pushed further east, stretching toward Belgium and the German border, the danger increased. The weather turned colder. The rain turned to sleet. The roads became sheets of ice, and the enemy became more desperate. The Germans were no longer retreating. They were fighting for their homeland. The ambushes became more frequent, more organized. The Red Ball drivers were beginning to take heavy casualties. Trucks were disappearing. Drivers were being killed by mines, by snipers, by strafing runs. The graveyards of the Quartermaster Corps were growing. But unlike the infantry, whose losses were reported in the papers, the deaths of the drivers were often statistical footnotes. Non-combat casualties, vehicle accidents. The army sanitized the language of their sacrifice. But the men knew. They saw the empty bunks in the bivouac areas. They saw the wrecked trucks pushed into the ditches. They knew the price of the gas they were delivering. They also knew something else. They knew they were winning. Every time they saw a Sherman tank rolling forward, they knew their gas was in the engine. Every time they heard an artillery barrage, they knew their shells were in the breach. They were the fuel of the victory. They were the momentum. And as the winter of 1944 approached, bringing with it the greatest test of the American Army, the Battle of the Bulge, the men of the Red Ball Express were about to be called upon to do more than just drive. They were about to be asked to pick up their rifles, leave their trucks, and stand in the line of fire as infantrymen. The distinction between rear and front was about to vanish completely. The drivers were about to become soldiers in the fullest, deadliest sense of the word. The road had hardened them. The MPs had toughened them. The Germans had tested them. Now, history was about to demand everything they had left. There is a limit to what the human body can endure. There is a point where the adrenaline fades, where the caffeine stops working, and where the mind simply unspools from reality. By November 1944, the men of the Red Ball Express had found that limit, and they had driven right past it. The convoy had become a death march on wheels. The initial sprint to save Patton's army had turned into a grinding marathon of attrition, a test of endurance that was breaking men as surely as it was breaking the trucks. The enemy now was not just the Germans or the MPs. It was biology. Sleep deprivation is a form of torture. Intelligence agencies use it to break prisoners. The Red Ball drivers were inflicting it on themselves voluntarily, day after day, for months. The standard shift was supposed to be manageable, but the reality of the war meant that drivers were often behind the wheel for 20, 30, even 40 hours at a stretch. The vibration of the steering column traveled up their arms and settled in their spines. The roar of the engine became a permanent tinnitus in their ears. They began to hallucinate. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was a total break from reality. Veterans would later describe seeing phantom convoys approaching them in the darkness, forcing them to swerve off the road to avoid collisions that weren't there. They saw bridges where there were only cliffs. They saw German squads standing in the middle of the road who dissolved into mist as the truck roared through them. They were driving in a waking dream, a twilight state where the line between life and death was measured in inches and seconds. And when the hallucinations took over, the crashes followed. The carnage on the Red Ball route was horrific. We often think of war casualties in terms of bullets and shrapnel, but for the Quartermaster Corps, the killer was inertia. A 2.5-ton truck loaded with 10,000 pounds of artillery shells, hitting a tree at 40 miles per hour, does not leave a body to bury. It leaves a smear. The physics of the collisions were unforgiving. Drivers who fell asleep for a microsecond would drift across the center line, slamming head-on into the returning convoy. The impact would telescope the cabs, crushing the drivers instantly. If the truck was carrying gasoline, the result was an inferno. The Red Ball Highway was marked not just by signs, but by the scorched skeletons of trucks that had burned by the roadside. The survivors didn't have time to mourn. They didn't have time to stop. They would drive past the burning wreck of a friend they had shared coffee with that morning, the heat of the fire warming the glass of their window, and they would keep going. To stop was to fail the mission. To stop was to let the men at the front die. So they grieved at 40 miles per hour, tears drying on their faces in the cold wind of the open cab. The physical toll extended beyond the crashes. The Red Ball rough ride became a medical diagnosis. The suspension of the GMC trucks was primitive, designed for durability, not comfort. Bouncing over bomb-cratered roads for months caused severe kidney damage, chronic spinal compression, and nerve damage in the hands. Men urinated blood. They lost the feeling in their fingers. They developed respiratory infections from the constant inhalation of diesel fumes and road dust. They were slowly being vibrated to pieces, but they were black soldiers. In the 1940s, Army, their pain was often dismissed as malingering. If a white pilot claimed exhaustion, he was given rest and a hot meal. If a black truck driver claimed exhaustion, he was told to get back in the cab or face a court-martial. The medical care available to them was segregated and often substandard. They were treated like the trucks they drove, machinery to be run until it broke, and then replaced. Then came the winter. The winter of 1944 was one of the coldest in European history. The rain turned to sleet, and the mud froze into jagged ruts that could snap an axle. The Red Ball trucks were canvas-topped. They had no heaters. The wind chill in the open cabs dropped well below zero. Drivers wrapped themselves in blankets, layers of newspapers, and stolen German greatcoats. Frostbite became a plague. Men had to be lifted out of their cabs at the end of a run because their legs were frozen into position. They lost toes and fingers to the cold, casualties of the weather just as surely as the infantry were casualties of the frost in the foxholes. But as the Red Ball Express was officially phased out in November to be replaced by other routes, a new crisis emerged that would demand even more from these men. On December 16, 1944, Adolf Hitler launched his last, desperate gamble. He threw 200,000 men and thousands of tanks against the thin Allied lines in the Ardennes forest. It was the Battle of the Bulge. The American line buckled. Panic spread through the rear echelon. The Germans were breaking through, aiming for the port of Antwerp to cut the Allied armies in half. General Eisenhower faced a nightmare. He was running out of riflemen. The casualties in the infantry were staggering, and the replacement system had collapsed. He needed bodies. He needed men who could shoot, men who could hold a line, men who had the courage to face the SS Panzers. He looked at the rear area. He looked at the hundreds of thousands of black troops serving in the Quartermaster Corps, the engineers, and the transportation units, and he made a decision that changed history. He issued a call for volunteers. He offered black soldiers in service units the chance to resign their current ranks and volunteer for immediate combat duty as infantrymen. The promise was implicit. You will fight. You will likely die. But you will fight as soldiers. The response was overwhelming. Over 4,500 black soldiers stepped forward. Many of them were drivers from the Red Ball Express. Think about that choice. These men had survived the suicide run of the convoys. They had endured the racism of the MPs. They had frozen in the cabs of their trucks. They could have stayed in the rear. They could have ridden out the war delivering boxes. It was safer. It was easier. But they didn't. They volunteered to go to the front. Why? Because they were warriors. because they knew that the only way to truly prove their equality was to bleed on the same snow as the white soldiers. Because they couldn't stand by while their country was in danger, even if that country treated them like second-class citizens. These volunteers were formed into 5th platoons. In a revolutionary move, Eisenhower ordered that these black platoons be attached directly to white infantry companies. For the first time in modern American history, the Army was integrated in combat. It wasn't a perfect integration. They were still segregated platoons, but they were fighting shoulder to shoulder, eating from the same mess kits, sleeping in the same frozen foxholes. The Red Ball drivers traded their steering wheels for M1 Garans and bars. They were sent to the hottest sectors of the Bulge. They fought at Bastogne. They fought at St. Vith. They fought across the Rhine, and they were magnificent. General Lanham of the 22nd Infantry Regiment famously told a black platoon, "I have never seen any soldiers who have performed better in combat than you." The white soldiers, initially skeptical, quickly learned that a black soldier shot just as straight and bled just as red. The shared trauma of the Bulge forged bonds that defied the Jim Crow laws back home. When you are freezing to death in a foxhole, you don't care about the race of the man sharing his blanket with you. You care that he is your brother. But the cost was devastating. The casualty rates for these volunteer platoons were astronomical. They were thrown into the teeth of the German counteroffensive. Many of the men who had miraculously survived thousands of miles of driving on the Red Ball Express were killed in their first week as infantrymen. They died in the snow of Belgium, thousands of miles from home, fighting for a freedom they had never fully tasted. There is a tragic irony in their sacrifice. When the Battle of the Bulge ended and the immediate crisis passed, the Army reverted to its old ways. The integrated platoons were often broken up. The men were sent back to their service units or discharged. The experiment in equality was declared over by the brass, even though it had been a resounding success. The Army tried to put the genie back in the bottle, but you cannot unring a bell. The men of the Red Ball Express who had become infantrymen had seen the truth. They had seen that they were the equals of any white man alive. They had killed the Nazi supermen. They had saved the American army from disaster. They carried that knowledge back home with them, a secret weapon that would eventually dismantle segregation in the United States. The toll of the Red Ball Express wasn't just in the men who died. It was in the men who came home broken. The chronic pain from the trucks, the PTSD from the crashes and the ambushes, the bitterness of having saved the world and then being told to go to the back of the line. Yet, they carried themselves with a dignity that was unassailable. They knew what they had done. They knew that without them, Patton's tanks would have been lawn ornaments. They knew that without them, the Battle of the Bulge might have been a German victory. They were the silent giants of the war. As the war in Europe ground to its final, bloody conclusion, in the spring of 1945, the Red Ball drivers, those who survived, looked back on the ribbon of road they had conquered. They had paved the way to Berlin with their sweat and their blood. They had delivered the victory. But as the ships prepared to take them home, the final insult awaited. They were about to find out that while they had defeated fascism in Europe, the racism in America was alive, well, and waiting for them on the dock. The Red Ball had reached its destination, but the drivers were still a long, long way from home. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Red Ball Express had already entered the realm of myth. The route itself was officially closed months earlier, replaced by trains and pipelines as the infrastructure was repaired. But the legend of the Red Ball had become shorthand for the impossible made possible. The statistics were staggering, numbers so large they almost lost their meaning. In just 81 days, the drivers had delivered over 412,000 tons of ammunition, food, and fuel. They had driven millions of miles, circling the globe dozens of times over on blown tires and seized engines. They had burned out their trucks and their bodies to ensure that the light of liberty didn't flicker out in Europe. But as the victory parades began in Paris and New York, a heavy silence descended on the men of the Quartermaster Corps. They stood on the docks, watching the white combat troops board the ships home first, watching the newsreels that showed white tank commanders and white paratroopers waving flags. They realized, with a sinking feeling in their guts, that the narrative was already being written and they were being edited out of the script. To the world, they were just drivers. They were the help. They were the background characters in the great drama of the greatest generation. The return to the United States was not a hero's welcome. It was a cold shower of reality. The men who had navigated minefields and fought off German ambushes stepped off the gangplanks and were immediately told to use the colored restrooms. They were told to sit in the back of the train cars. They were denied service at lunch counters in towns where German prisoners of war were allowed to sit and eat. The cognitive dissonance was enough to drive a man insane. They had conquered the Wehrmacht, but they could not conquer the deep, systemic rot of American racism. The post-war era brought a specific, devastating betrayal, the denial of the GI Bill. On paper, the GI Bill was the greatest engine of social mobility in American history. It offered veterans low-interest mortgages, tuition for college, and business loans. It built the modern white middle class. It built the suburbs. It built the universities. But for the black veterans of the Red Ball Express, the GI Bill was a mirage. The administration of the benefits was left to local states and municipalities. In the South, and often in the North, black veterans were systematically blocked from accessing these rights. A Red Ball driver who wanted to go to college to become an engineer, using the mechanical skills he honed fixing trucks under fire, was told that the local colleges were segregated or full. A veteran who wanted to buy a home for his family was told by banks that they wouldn't lend to him in desirable neighborhoods, a practice known as redlining. The wealth that was generated by the victory in World War II was siphoned away from the very men who had delivered the fuel for that victory. They were left to return to the sharecropping fields, the janitorial jobs, the low-wage labor that the Army had said was their natural place. This economic violence was compounded by physical violence. The sight of a black man in a uniform, wearing the ribbons of the European theater, enraged the enforcers of Jim Crow. There were blindings. There were lynchings. There were beatings of veterans who dared to assert their dignity. They had survived the Nazis only to be hunted by their neighbors, but the Red Ball Express had changed these men. You cannot drive through hell and come out the other side as the same person. The road had hardened them. It had taught them that they were capable of extraordinary things. They had looked at the impossible and run it over with a 2.5-ton truck. They returned to America not as victims, but as men with a deep, simmering resolve. The logistical genius they displayed in France didn't disappear. It was redeployed. The organizational skills required to keep thousands of trucks moving in synchronization were applied to a new purpose: the civil rights movement. Look at the logistics of the Montgomery bus boycott. Look at the organization of the Freedom Rides. Look at the discipline of the marchers in Selma. You see the DNA of the Army Supply Corps. You see men who knew how to move people, how to sustain a movement, how to keep going when the road was blocked. The legacy of the Red Ball Express is not just in the battles won in 1944. It is in the battles won in the 1950s and 60s. The Double V campaign, Victory Abroad and Victory at Home, took longer than they hoped, but they never stopped driving toward it. Culturally, however, they remained invisible for decades. Hollywood movies about the war showed white drivers joking in Jeeps. The gritty, exhausting, black coffee reality of the black truckers was absent from the screen. It wasn't until the 1970s and beyond, as black historians began to reclaim their own stories, that the Red Ball Express began to re-enter the national consciousness. But even then, it was often treated as a footnote, a curiosity of logistics, rather than a central pillar of the war effort. We need to be clear about this. Without the Red Ball Express, the Allies do not win in 1945. Patton's army would have stalled in the middle of France, sitting ducks for a German counteroffensive. The war would have dragged on. The V-2 rockets would have rained down on London for another year. The Holocaust would have continued unchecked for months longer. The atomic bomb might have been used in Europe. The men driving those trucks didn't just deliver gas. They delivered time. They delivered life. They shortened the war and saved millions of people.